What would you do if you were caught between two of the world's most powerful people, both willing to destroy you for their own gain? Jackson Williams, a lowly flight attendant, is suddenly thrust into a dangerous game of manipulation and betrayal. After a heated confrontation with billionaire Nicole Blackwell, Jackson finds himself forced to choose sides between Nicole and her rival, Jonathan Easton. With each move, the stakes get higher, and trust becomes a deadly currency. One wrong choice could cost him everything, and the question becomes, who will win this dangerous game? Hope grows when we share it, and I'm so grateful you're here. One wrong move could change everything. Subscribe to find out what happens. Nicole Blackwell was not used to being challenged, especially not by someone who worked for her. She sat in the plush leather chair of her private jet, staring out of the window as the plane cruised above the clouds, the lights of the city far below. The smooth hum of the engines was almost meditative, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside her. She had just left a high-stakes board meeting where she'd successfully fought to take control of a major merger, silencing every doubter with a calm, precise logic. As usual, she had crushed her competitors with her ruthlessness, walking out of that conference room as though she were untouchable. But now, in the quiet solitude of her jet, she felt the flicker of irritation. Her flight attendant, Jackson Cole, had made a misstep, and she could already feel the frustration creeping up. She wasn't accustomed to such petty disturbances, especially not when it came to people like him, someone whose entire job was to ensure her comfort. Nicole pressed the button on the side of her armrest, summoning Jackson to her side. He appeared almost immediately, his crisp uniform in place, but there was a stiffness to his gait, a subtle tension in his movements that she noted instantly. "What is it now?" Nicole asked, her voice cold but not unkind. It was the tone she reserved for employees who needed to remember their place. "Ms. Blackwell," Jackson began, "I've noticed the cabin temperature is a bit low. Would you like me to adjust it for you?" Nicole's gaze narrowed as she surveyed him. He was tall, with dark, messy hair and a chiseled jawline that could have been charming in a different context. But right now, he was nothing more than an irritating employee whose job was to cater to her every whim. "The temperature is fine," she snapped. "Don't waste my time with trivial matters." Jackson hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to back down or continue. He wasn't a man easily intimidated, but Nicole's presence was almost suffocating, the power she exuded both alluring and infuriating. He cleared his throat, deciding to push forward. "Ms. Blackwell," he began again, this time more forcefully, "I'm just trying to make sure you're comfortable. I'd like to take care of anything you need before we land." Nicole's lips curved into a thin smile, a smile that was less than friendly. She knew exactly what she was doing, pushing his buttons. But she didn't expect him to respond this way. "Are you questioning me, Jackson?" she asked, her voice suddenly dangerous, low. Jackson's eyes flickered, but he kept his composure. "No, of course not, ma'am. I'm just doing my job." For a moment, the tension hung in the air, thick enough to cut with a knife. But Nicole wasn't finished. She leaned forward, looking him dead in the eye. "Then stop wasting my time and get me something to drink. You're acting like I've asked for the impossible." Jackson stood frozen, his fists clenched at his sides. His pulse quickened as anger simmered beneath his skin. He had endured much worse from passengers, but something about Nicole's entitled attitude, her way of making everything feel so small, pushed him past the point of tolerance. "I'll be right back with your drink," he said, his voice tight, before turning to leave the cabin. But as he turned his back to her, his frustration boiled over. The sudden snap of his emotions shocked even him. He turned back around, walked toward Nicole, and before he knew it, his hand collided with her cheek with a loud, sickening smack. The sound echoed through the cabin. Nicole's eyes widened in shock, her perfectly composed expression faltering for only a second. Then, just as quickly, her demeanor returned to its usual icy perfection. She stared at Jackson, who stood frozen in horror, realizing what he had just done. "Did you just hit me?" Nicole asked, her voice calm, but carrying the weight of 1,000 threats. She didn't yell. She didn't scream. Instead, her gaze pierced through him with a chilling, controlled fury. Jackson's heart raced in his chest, and a wave of regret hit him like a freight train. I didn't mean to. I'm sorry, Ms. Blackwell. Enough, Nicole interrupted, standing up from her seat. You'll regret this, Jackson. Jackson went back to the cabin. He stood there, trembling slightly, his mind whirling as the reality of what he had just done settled in. He had slapped her. He had slapped a woman who was not just any woman, but a powerful billionaire with connections in places he could never dream of. His apology felt hollow in his throat as he sank into a nearby seat, the weight of his actions settling in. He had just made a dangerous enemy. But what Jackson didn't know was that Nicole wasn't someone who would simply walk away from an insult. She didn't forget slights, and the more he thought about the situation, the more he realized this was far from over. As the plane continued its flight, Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that something far more dangerous than his slap was looming on the horizon. Nicole Blackwell always got what she wanted, and right now, what she wanted was revenge. Jackson stood at the back of the plane, his eyes fixed on the door that Nicole had slammed shut. His breath came in shallow bursts, his heart still racing from the explosion of emotion. The silence in the cabin was oppressive, as if the whole world was holding its breath. He had just done the unthinkable, slapped one of the most powerful women in the business world. What was he thinking? He ran a hand through his hair, pacing back and forth. A cold sweat beaded on his forehead, and a sense of dread began to settle deep in his gut. This wasn't just a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a career-ending mistake. And worst of all, he had no idea how Nicole was going to retaliate. "Get it together, Jackson," he muttered to himself, trying to calm his racing thoughts. But the words felt hollow, unable to erase the pit in his stomach. He had no clue how far she would go to make him pay for this, and the unknown made it even more terrifying. The flight attendants who were still in the cabin moved cautiously around him, their movements quieter than usual. They must have heard the slap, felt the tension in the air, but no one dared to approach him, not wanting to risk getting caught in the crossfire of whatever was about to unfold. He glanced toward the front of the cabin, hoping for some sign of Nicole, but there was nothing, just the hum of the engines and the soft murmur of passengers. She was still in her private section of the jet, and Jackson knew that once she was done with him, the consequences would come swiftly. And then it happened. The intercom crackled to life, a sharp tone piercing through the air. Jackson's stomach dropped. "Jackson!" The captain's voice came through, steady but laced with something unsettling. "Please come to the cockpit. We need to speak." Jackson's throat tightened. His legs felt like lead as he made his way forward, each step feeling heavier than the last. By the time he reached the cockpit, his mind was racing with all the worst-case scenarios. Was Nicole already pulling strings? Was this the beginning of the end? He stepped into the cockpit and was met by the captain's somber expression. The co-pilot, sitting silently beside him, looked equally uncomfortable. "Jackson," the captain began, his tone grave. "We've received a complaint from one of our high-profile passengers. Nicole Blackwell, in fact." Jackson's heart skipped a beat. He had known this moment would come, but hearing it spoken aloud felt like a punch to the gut. "What kind of complaint?" Jackson asked, trying to keep his voice steady, though it trembled with anxiety. "The report states that you assaulted Ms. Blackwell. Is this true?" Jackson's chest tightened. He couldn't deny it. Not now. "Yes," he said quietly. I slapped her." The captain exchanged a look with the co-pilot. "Jackson, you know this is serious. Nicole Blackwell isn't someone you can cross. She's made it clear that she's going to take action, and it won't be pretty." Jackson felt a cold wave of panic wash over him. "What does that mean? What's going to happen to me?" "I'm afraid we'll have to report this to higher-ups at the airline," the captain replied. "We're pulling into the airport, and I've been instructed to have you escorted off the plane once we land." The words hit Jackson like a freight train. He had expected punishment, but hearing it spelled out like that made it all too real. His job, his livelihood, was slipping away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. "We'll have to take it from here," the captain said, his voice firm. "Just stay calm and don't cause any more trouble." Jackson nodded numbly, his mind reeling. He wanted to scream, to protest, but he knew it would make no difference. There was no backing down now. Nicole had all the power, and he had just given her an excuse to bring him to his knees. As he turned to leave the cockpit, he caught a glimpse of the passengers in the cabin. They were whispering to each other, casting furtive glances in his direction. Word must have spread about the altercation, and the passengers were likely enjoying the drama. But none of them knew what was really at stake. None of them knew how dangerous this woman could be. He walked back into the cabin, feeling every eye on him as he made his way to the back. His uniform felt tight around him, suffocating him. He had always been a good flight attendant, professional, courteous, but now he was the villain in someone else's story. He reached the back of the plane and sat down in an empty seat, trying to collect his thoughts. But it was hard to focus when the looming threat of Nicole's retaliation hovered over him like a dark cloud. She wasn't just any passenger, she was a billionaire with connections, someone who could destroy him without breaking a sweat. Minutes passed, or maybe it was hours. He couldn't tell. The rest of the flight felt like a blur, time stretching out as his mind raced with anxiety and fear. Finally, the announcement came that the plane was preparing to land, and Jackson's stomach churned as the jet began its descent. The wheels touched down with a soft thud, and the plane slowed to a stop at the gate. As the engines powered down, Jackson stood up and made his way to the door. He had one last chance to salvage whatever dignity he had left, but deep down, he knew it was over. When the door opened, 2 security officers were standing at the end of the jet bridge. Jackson's heart sank. This was it. "Jackson Cole," one of the officers said, his voice stern. "You're going to need to come with us." As he was escorted off the plane, Jackson caught one last glimpse of Nicole through the window. She was sitting in her seat, her back straight, her eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. But there was something in the way she held herself that sent a chill down his spine. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Jackson's heart was still pounding as the security officers led him through the sterile corridors of the airport. His mind was reeling, unable to process what had just happened. One moment, he was working, doing his job like any other day, and the next, his career was in ruins. The worst part was that he had no control over it, no way to reverse the damage. The officers didn't speak as they guided him toward the exit. Jackson had no idea where they were taking him, but at this point, it didn't matter. He could already hear the whispers of his colleagues in his mind, see the headlines in the tabloids. Flight Attendant Slaps Billionaire, career destroyed in a single blow. But as they passed through the terminal, something in the back of Jackson's mind gnawed at him. The humiliation of being escorted off the plane was bad enough, but what bothered him more was the eerie calm with which Nicole had taken the slap. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't retaliated. She'd simply walked away, like she was already plotting her next move. There was something off about the whole situation, and Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just another disgruntled employee to Nicole. She was far more dangerous than that. She had power, connections, and the ability to destroy people who crossed her. Jackson was just one more name on her list of targets. Once they reached the security checkpoint, the officers stopped and turned to face him. "We'll need you to stay here while we finalize the paperwork," one of them said. Jackson nodded numbly, too tired to argue. He sat down on one of the cold metal chairs, trying to gather his thoughts. His mind kept drifting back to Nicole and the chilling look in her eyes when she'd threatened him. "You'll regret this, Jackson." Her words echoed in his mind, and a cold shiver ran down his spine. That's when his phone buzzed in his pocket. His breath caught in his throat as he pulled it out, almost afraid to see what awaited him on the other side of the screen. He knew it wasn't going to be good. The message was from an unknown number. "We need to talk. Now." Jackson frowned, staring at the message. He didn't recognize the number, but it wasn't the sender that caught his attention. It was the timing. He had just been humiliated, publicly ousted from his job, and now someone was reaching out, wanting to talk. There was only one person who might have this kind of leverage over him: Nicole Blackwell. But why would she contact him now, after everything that had just happened? He typed a quick response, his fingers trembling as he did so. "Who is this?" He hit send, but before he could think, another message arrived almost instantly. "You know exactly who I am. Meet me at the airport lounge in 20 minutes. Jackson's stomach twisted. This was too strange. He had no idea what was going on, but part of him, part of his gut instinct, told him this wasn't over. Nicole was playing some kind of game, and he was her pawn. He didn't know whether to comply, but the idea of facing whatever was waiting for him was better than sitting here in limbo. Jackson stood up, giving the officers a brief nod. "I'll be back in a moment," he said, and they didn't stop him. As he made his way through the terminal toward the lounge, his mind raced. Was this some sort of trick? Was Nicole trying to further humiliate him, to make him squirm? Or was it something more? What was her angle? He finally reached the airport lounge, its glass walls offering a view of the tarmac. The low hum of people talking blended with the clink of coffee cups and the shuffle of feet. But there was no sign of Nicole, at least not yet. Jackson took a seat at a corner table, his eyes scanning the room nervously. Minutes passed, and just when he began to think he had been set up, the door to the lounge opened. A tall, slender figure stepped inside, dressed in a sharp suit. It wasn't Nicole, but it was someone just as unsettling. A man, probably in his early 40s, with dark hair and a cool, calculating demeanor, walked toward Jackson with a slow, purposeful stride. He was dressed like a high-powered executive, but his sharp eyes gave away his true nature, someone who was used to dealing with dangerous situations. "You're Jackson Cole, right?" the man asked, his voice smooth, almost too smooth. Jackson nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes. Who are you?" The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You don't need to know my name. What matters is that I'm here on behalf of someone who thinks you've made quite the impression." Jackson's blood ran cold. It wasn't Nicole herself, but this man was clearly someone who worked for her. His heart hammered in his chest as the realization hit him. Nicole's reach was far wider than he had imagined. "Nicole Blackwell," the man continued, sitting down across from him without asking permission. "She doesn't take kindly to being slapped, especially not in public. But she's a reasonable woman. You'll get a chance to make things right." Jackson leaned forward, his voice shaky. How do I make it right?" The man's smile widened, but there was something predatory in it. "Oh, it's very simple. You do exactly what Nicole tells you to do when she tells you to do it. If you do that, perhaps we can put this whole thing behind us. If not—" He trailed off, letting the threat hang in the air like a shadow. Jackson sat back, feeling a chill creep over him. He had no idea what kind of game Nicole was playing, but he wasn't about to back down without a fight. Whatever this was, it was far from over. "I won't be your puppet," Jackson said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. The man's eyes darkened, but his smile never faltered. "I think you'll find that you have very little choice in the matter." Jackson had just become a player in a much larger game than he could have ever anticipated, and Nicole Blackwell wasn't someone who lost. Jackson felt the weight of the man's words press down on him, suffocating in their implication. This wasn't just about the slap anymore. It was about something far darker, something that he couldn't yet fully grasp. Nicole Blackwell had power, and she wasn't afraid to wield it. "I don't understand," Jackson said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you want from me? What's the point of all this?" The man leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers together. He looked at Jackson with cold amusement, as though he were a subject to be toyed with. "Nicole has a reputation to maintain, a reputation that you've now threatened. This isn't just about you, Jackson. This is about sending a message." Jackson's mind raced. Sending a message? What kind of message could this possibly be? All he had done was slap her in a moment of frustration. He never imagined it would spiral into something this extreme. "Nicole doesn't tolerate weakness," the man continued, his voice low and deliberate. "She doesn't tolerate anyone who challenges her authority. And that slap, while it may have been an outburst, was perceived as a challenge. She doesn't just want to punish you. She wants to make sure you understand the consequences of crossing her." Jackson shook his head, trying to make sense of it all. "So, what? You're going to ruin my life? Destroy me?" The man's eyes narrowed slightly. "Oh, it's much more than that. You see, Nicole's world is one of perfection. Everything she touches turns to gold, except for the people who think they can get away with disrespecting her. Jackson's heart dropped as the implications of those words hit him like a freight train. He wasn't just dealing with a wealthy woman with a vendetta. He was dealing with someone who had a machine, a network, that could ruin him in ways he couldn't even fathom. "You don't understand," the man said, leaning forward slightly, his voice lowering to a dangerous whisper. "Nicole's network is global. She controls things you wouldn't even begin to comprehend. One phone call, and you'll lose your job, your reputation, everything. It's not just the airline. She has connections in every industry. If she wants to erase you from existence, she will." Jackson's throat went dry. He could feel the weight of the truth settling into his bones. He had made a mistake, a monumental mistake, and now he was paying the price. Nicole's cold, calculating nature had just drawn him into a game where the stakes were life and death, career and survival. "You have one chance, Jackson," the man said, breaking the silence. "Nicole has decided to offer you an opportunity. It's a simple choice. Do as she says, and we can all move on. Disobey, and you'll find yourself in a place where no one can help you. Ever." The tension in the air was palpable. Jackson's mind was reeling, trying to come to terms with the gravity of the situation. His job was already gone, but the threat of losing everything else, his freedom, his dignity, his future, was far worse. He swallowed hard, his fingers tightening into fists. "What does she want me to do?" The man's eyes gleamed with something like satisfaction. "That's for her to tell you. But understand this. The moment you refuse, the moment you hesitate, is the moment you sign your own fate. Nicole Blackwell doesn't make idle threats." Jackson clenched his jaw, his mind racing through every possible outcome. There was no escape. If he refused, she would destroy him. If he complied, he was giving up control of his life, letting her dictate his every move. There was no easy choice. A message pinged on his phone, startling him. It was another text from the same unknown number. His hands trembled as he unlocked his phone. "Meet me at my office tomorrow, 9 a.m. Sharp. I'll have your instructions ready." The air around Jackson seemed to grow colder as the reality of his situation settled in. He was trapped. There was no way out. "You'll be expected at the office," the man said, his voice breaking through Jackson's thoughts. "Tomorrow, 9 a.m. Don't be late." Jackson nodded, too numb to say anything more. He had no choice. If he hoped to salvage anything from this nightmare, he had to play along. He had to survive. As the man stood to leave, Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning, the feeling that Nicole Blackwell was playing a game that he couldn't win. The next day, Jackson's alarm clock blared in his ear, dragging him out of a restless sleep. The night had been long, filled with anxiety, and as he lay in bed, the weight of his predicament seemed to crush him further with each passing hour. How had he gone from an ordinary flight attendant to a man whose fate was now in the hands of one of the wealthiest and most powerful women in the world? He swung his legs over the side of the bed, feeling the cold hardwood floor beneath his feet. The reality of the situation hit him again, making his stomach turn. There was no turning back now. Nicole would expect him at her office, and whatever this opportunity was, he knew it wouldn't be anything he could walk away from without consequences. Jackson dressed quickly, his mind still whirling with questions. He had no idea what Nicole wanted from him, but he knew one thing for sure. It wouldn't be easy. It never was with her. By the time he arrived at the sleek, glass and steel skyscraper that housed Nicole's empire, he could feel his palms sweating. He had been in the building before, but this time was different. This time, he wasn't just a faceless employee. He was a man on the edge, stepping into the lion's den. The receptionist barely looked up as he approached, but when she saw him, she straightened in her chair. Without a word, she gestured toward the elevator. Jackson stepped inside, his stomach a knot of anxiety. When the doors opened to the top floor, he was greeted by a glass-walled office with a view that took his breath away. Nicole sat behind her massive desk, the picture of power and control, looking out over the city below. She didn't stand when he entered. She didn't smile. She didn't do anything, except watch him with those cold, calculating eyes. Jackson's knees almost buckled under her gaze, but he forced himself to stand tall. Jackson stood frozen in the doorway of Nicole Blackwell's office, his heart hammering in his chest. The silence between them stretched out like a taut wire, pulling at his nerves. There was no warmth in Nicole's expression, only a cold, calculating stare that made him feel as though he were a mere pawn in her grand game. She was everything he had imagined, poised, composed, and undeniably powerful. The office around them was sleek and modern, with an almost sterile elegance. Every detail was meticulously designed, just like the woman who controlled this empire. But nothing in the room gave off any sense of comfort or welcome. Nicole didn't stand. She didn't need to. Her presence alone commanded attention. Her fingers lightly tapped the surface of her desk as she continued to watch Jackson, her gaze unreadable. "So," she said, her voice smooth but carrying an edge that made Jackson flinch, "you've come. Now, let's talk." Jackson swallowed hard, trying to steady his breath. He stepped forward, his shoes clicking against the polished floor, and sat across from her without being invited. His hands trembled, but he clenched them into fists to stop them from shaking. Nicole studied him for a moment, then leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs with the grace of a predator about to strike. "You're probably wondering why I've brought you here," she said. "You're wondering what this is all about, aren't you?" Jackson nodded. He couldn't speak. He wasn't sure if his voice would betray the fear clawing at his chest, but the question burned inside him. Why was she doing this? Why didn't she just finish him off and be done with it? Nicole's lips curled into a knowing smile, as if she had already read his mind. "You see, Jackson, you've made a mistake, a big one. But you also have something I want, something that I think might be valuable to me, depending on how you play your cards." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing with an intensity that made Jackson's breath catch in his throat. "You're not as useless to me as you think." Jackson's brow furrowed. "What do you want from me?" She looked at him with a mix of amusement and disdain. "You're in a position right now where you're forced to listen to me, to do as I say, but you're also in a position where you still have some value. If you help me achieve my goal, you might just get out of this with your dignity and your future intact. If you don't, well," she let the threat hang in the air, her smile never wavering. Jackson clenched his jaw. "What's the catch? What exactly do you want me to do?" Nicole's eyes sparkled with something dark and calculated. "I need you to sabotage someone who's become a thorn in my side." She paused, watching his reaction closely. "And I need you to do it quietly, cleanly. If you succeed, I'll make sure the mess you've gotten yourself into is wiped away. Your career, your reputation, they'll be restored. If you fail—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. The meaning was clear. Failure would be more than just the end of his career. It would be the end of his life as he knew it. Jackson's mind raced. Sabotage? He had no idea who she was talking about or what exactly she needed done, but the implications were horrifying. He had no experience in this kind of thing. He had never imagined he'd find himself at the mercy of someone like Nicole. But she was right about one thing. He had no choice. He was in too deep now. This wasn't just a matter of pride or principle. This was survival. "Who do you want me to target?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Nicole leaned back in her chair, her eyes glinting with amusement, as if she were savoring the moment. "There's a man. His name is Jonathan Easton. He's a high-ranking executive at one of my competitors. He's been trying to destroy everything I've built for the past year, and he's getting close to succeeding. I want you to find a way to ruin his reputation, his career. Make sure he's gone from the industry permanently." Jackson's stomach twisted. "Why me? Why not just go after him yourself?" Nicole's expression didn't change. "Because I need someone who's not directly tied to me. Someone who can operate under the radar. Someone who won't raise suspicion. And you're the perfect candidate. You already have a public profile. You've been in the media recently. If you can plant the right story, the right evidence, no one will suspect a thing." Jackson's heart pounded in his chest. The thought of intentionally destroying someone's life made him sick, but he had no other choice. His whole body felt heavy with dread as the weight of the decision crushed him. "What's the story you want me to plant?" Jackson asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Nicole smirked. "I don't have the details just yet, but I'll provide you with everything you need. You just have to do what I tell you, and you must do it quickly. Easton's getting closer to taking me down, and I need him gone before he can make his next move." Jackson felt as though the room was closing in on him. He could feel the walls pressing in on his chest, suffocating him. There was no escape, no way to back out now. Nicole stood, her tall frame towering over him as she walked around her desk, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. She came to stand beside him, her voice low and commanding. "Do this right, Jackson, and I'll make sure you're rewarded. I'll take care of everything. The job, your reputation, everything." She smiled down at him with the coldness of a shark preparing to devour its prey. "But if you fail, remember, I don't make threats. I make promises." Her words sent a shiver down his spine. He was trapped, caught in a web of manipulation and power that he didn't fully understand, but had no way out of. Jackson took a deep breath, his mind swirling with conflicting emotions. He had been handed a devil's bargain, ruin someone's life for his own survival. He stood up, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "I'll do it. I'll make sure it's done." Nicole smiled, a cold, calculating smile that sent chills down Jackson's spine. "Good. I knew you'd make the right decision. Now let's get to work." The clock was ticking, and Nicole's game had just begun. Jackson's first few days after his meeting with Nicole felt like he was trapped in a nightmare. His mind constantly replayed her cold, calculated words, each one echoing in his thoughts, drowning out everything else. He had agreed to ruin Jonathan Easton's life, to make sure Nicole's empire remained untouched. But as each hour passed, doubt began to creep in. Was he really willing to go this far? Was this the man he had become? The weight of the decision pressed on him, suffocating him with its gravity. Every time he closed his eyes, he could see Jonathan Easton's face, imagining what it would feel like to tear apart everything that man had worked for. His stomach churned at the thought. But then he remembered Nicole's promise, his job, his reputation. Everything would be restored. She would give him the chance to make it all right again. He had no other choice. He was already in too deep. It was late one evening when Jackson received an encrypted email from Nicole. The subject line was simple: "Your next steps." He hesitated before opening it, his hand trembling slightly. The email contained several documents and detailed instructions on how to execute the plan. There was a particular story Nicole wanted him to plant, one that would destroy Jonathan's reputation completely. It was clever, calculated. Nicole had found a way to tie Easton to a controversial investment deal that had gone south, and she wanted Jackson to leak it to the press. The details were intricate, involving falsified documents, financial records, and an insider source who would back up the story. The worst part was the human angle. Nicole wanted to frame Jonathan as someone who had not only failed in his professional life, but had also caused real harm to innocent people. The plan was to make sure that once the story broke, no one would ever trust Jonathan Easton again. Jackson's fingers hovered over the keyboard as he read the email over and over again. It was precise, deadly. He knew it would work. And yet, something inside him recoiled. What if it goes too far, he thought. What if Jonathan's life is ruined forever? But the answer was always the same. Nicole didn't care. She had a goal, and she would stop at nothing to achieve it. The next morning, Jackson met with a contact who Nicole had set up, a journalist named Elise Parker, someone who was known for digging up dirt on people with a vengeance. Elise was no stranger to shady deals, and she had been more than willing to take Jackson's money for the story. They sat across from each other at a small cafe near the airport. Elise was a sharp woman, her eyes scanning Jackson as if she could read his every thought. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. "So, you have the story?" Elise asked, her voice low but demanding. Jackson's stomach churned. He had already printed the documents that would be sent to the press. They were all set, but as he handed them over to her, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was crossing a line he wouldn't be able to come back from. Elise took the documents, her eyes flicking over them quickly. "This is good," she said with a grin. "This will bring Easton down for sure. But remember, Jackson, this is a one-way street. Once I run this story, there's no turning back." He nodded, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I understand." Elise picked up her coffee cup and swirled it, deep in thought. "There's just one thing," she added, her tone changing. "Nicole Blackwell isn't someone you want to get on the wrong side of, is she? Because once you're in her orbit, there's no escape. She'll own you, and she'll never let you go." Jackson felt a chill run down his spine. "I'm not worried about that," he said, but his voice betrayed him. "I just need the story out there." Elise leaned back in her chair, eyeing him closely. "Just remember, Jackson, when it's all over, you'll have to live with the consequences of your choices. And Nicole, well, she doesn't care who she uses or discards along the way." With that, Elise stood up, slipping the documents into her bag with a swift motion. "I'll take care of this. You'll hear from me once it's live." Jackson nodded, his mind racing. As Elise disappeared into the crowd, Jackson sat there for a long moment, lost in thought. He had just handed over the key to Jonathan Easton's destruction. The plan was set in motion, and there was no going back. The next few days passed in a blur. Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. His nerves were on edge, and every time his phone buzzed, he couldn't help but flinch. Was it Elise? Was the story out yet? What was happening? Then, on the third day after the meeting, he received a call. It wasn't from Elise. It was from a number he didn't recognize. "Jackson," the voice on the other end said, and it was a voice he didn't recognize, but there was something familiar about it. "This is Jonathan Easton. We need to talk." Jackson's heart stopped. Jonathan Easton was calling him? How had he found him? Before Jackson could say anything, Jonathan continued, "I know what you've done. I know you're involved in this smear campaign against me, and I want to know why. Why would you do this?" Jackson's blood ran cold. How the hell did he find out? "Jonathan, Jackson stammered, trying to collect himself, but Jonathan cut him off. "Don't lie to me. I know you were the one who planted that story. The documents you handed over to Elise, the information about my investments, it's all come back to me." Jonathan's voice was low, but there was an edge to it. He wasn't panicking. He was calm, in control. Jackson was speechless. How could Jonathan know? Had Elise betrayed him? "Listen," Jonathan continued, his voice unwavering. "I don't know who you're working for, but this isn't over. If you think you're going to get away with this, you're wrong. You have no idea what you've just started." Jackson's mind raced, but he couldn't come up with an answer. He had been caught in a lie, and now there was no way out. Jonathan's next words sent a chill through his bones. "I'll be at your apartment tonight. We need to have a real conversation." And with that, the line went dead. Jackson stared at his phone, his heart pounding in his chest. What had he just done? Jackson paced the floor of his apartment, his mind racing. He couldn't focus on anything. Every shadow seemed darker, every creak of the floorboards louder. Jonathan Easton knew what he had done, and now he was coming for him. The conversation on the phone had unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Jonathan's calm, collected demeanor was unnerving. He wasn't threatening or angry. He was too controlled. It was as if he already knew exactly how things would play out. Jackson had thought that once he planted the story, the problem would be over. But Jonathan's call had thrown him into disarray. What did he know? How had he found out? Was Elise the leak? Or was someone else pulling the strings? The apartment felt suffocating. Jackson glanced at the clock on the wall. It was already 8:30 p.m. The time was ticking down, and he had no idea what kind of conversation Jonathan was planning. The doorbell rang, sharp and abrupt, and Jackson's heart skipped a beat. He froze. It's him. It's Jonathan. He hesitated for a moment, then walked to the door, his legs feeling heavy. His hand trembled as he gripped the doorknob, and when he opened it, he was met with a sight he hadn't expected. Jonathan Easton stood there, looking every bit the confident, untouchable executive that he was. But the man's presence was different now, more intense than before. His eyes were piercing, focused, but there was no malice in them, only a calm, unnerving resolve. Jackson stepped aside to let him in, his voice a little shaky as he spoke. "You said we needed to talk?" Jonathan nodded, stepping into the apartment without saying another word. He didn't even look around. His eyes were fixed on Jackson the entire time. The silence between them was heavy, thick with the tension of the moment. Finally, Jonathan spoke. "You made a mistake, Jackson," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You've played a dangerous game, and now you're caught in it." Jackson swallowed, trying to mask the fear creeping up his spine. "I didn't have a choice." Jonathan's gaze intensified. Everyone has a choice. He took a slow step toward Jackson, his voice never wavering. "I don't know who's behind this, but I'll find out. And when I do, I won't let this go. You'll regret crossing me." Jackson felt his breath catch in his throat. He had never felt so small, so exposed. Jonathan was different from Nicole. He wasn't using manipulation or promises of rewards. Jonathan's power came from a place of absolute certainty, and that was what made him so dangerous. But before Jackson could speak, Jonathan continued. "You might be thinking that Nicole has you in her pocket, that she's going to protect you. But she won't. She's using you, Jackson. And when she's done, she'll discard you like everyone else." The words hit Jackson like a physical blow. Nicole had been the one to promise him everything. She had promised him safety, success, power. But Jonathan was right. She hadn't promised him loyalty. He was just another pawn in her game. Jackson clenched his fists, the weight of the realization sinking in. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice tight with desperation. Jonathan took another step forward, his voice dropping to a low whisper. "I want you to understand that your life is in my hands now. You've crossed a line, Jackson, but you can still make things right. There's still time to fix it, but only if you help me." Jackson blinked, confused. "Help you? How?" Jonathan's eyes glinted with an almost predatory intensity. "You know Nicole Blackwell, don't you? You know how she operates. I need you to turn on her, Jackson. Tell me everything you know about her plans, her strategies, her weaknesses. If you do that, I'll make sure you're not ruined in the fallout. But if you keep working for her, if you continue with this plot against me, I'll destroy you." Jackson felt the blood drain from his face. This was no longer a matter of simple sabotage. It was a fight for survival between two powerful forces, Nicole and Jonathan, and Jackson was stuck in the middle. "Why should I trust you?" Jackson whispered, his voice barely audible. Jonathan smiled, but it was cold, devoid of warmth. "Because I'm offering you a way out. Nicole won't. She'll use you until you're of no more value to her. But me? I'll give you something real." The words were tempting, but Jackson's mind was in turmoil. Betraying Nicole would mean throwing away the last chance he had for redemption, for a future where he wasn't running from his past. But helping Jonathan meant risking everything he'd worked for. Jonathan must have seen the hesitation in his eyes because he continued, his voice almost soothing now. "I'm not asking you to destroy her, Jackson. Just help me stop her from destroying everything I've worked for. We can take her down together. We can expose her for what she truly is." Jackson's breath caught in his throat. Take her down? Was this really the only way out? Jonathan took a step back, giving him space, letting the weight of the decision sink in. "You have until tomorrow to decide. I'm giving you a way out, Jackson, but the clock is ticking." With those words, Jonathan turned and walked to the door, his every movement radiating control. Before stepping out, he paused, glancing over his shoulder. "Think carefully. Your next move is everything." And with that, he was gone. Jackson stood there, alone, the silence in the apartment deafening. The weight of Jonathan's words settled on him like a crushing burden. Nicole had promised him safety and power, but Jonathan had promised him a way out. There was no easy answer, no clean path forward. Jackson could feel the walls closing in on him. He had been caught in a game of manipulation, of ruthless ambition, and now, the two players who had shaped his life were forcing him to choose sides. The clock was ticking. Jackson sat in the silence of his apartment, his mind whirling. The weight of the decision was unbearable, and the walls seemed to close in around him, pressing him with the urgency of his choice. He could still hear Jonathan's words echoing in his head. "You have until tomorrow to decide. What would Nicole say if she found out? Jackson thought. What would she do to me if I betrayed her? He glanced at his phone, the messages from Nicole still sitting there, unread. She had sent him another update on the plan to destroy Jonathan Easton's reputation, details about the next step in their scheme. But now, it all felt hollow, like a carefully constructed facade that hid a deadly truth. Jackson had learned two things in the last few days. First, that Jonathan Easton was not someone you wanted to cross. He was a man of influence, capable of seeing through even the most carefully laid plans. Second, Nicole Blackwell was ruthless, playing a game that demanded absolute loyalty from everyone around her. The moment she thought you were no longer useful, she would discard you without a second thought. The decision wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about power, trust, and betrayal. And Jackson knew he couldn't afford to be the pawn in someone else's game any longer. The next morning, Jackson went to work early. He had made up his mind. The choice wasn't easy, but it was the only one that made sense in the moment. He needed to meet Jonathan, needed to see if the man's offer was real or if it was just another manipulative tactic. But more than anything, Jackson needed a way out of the life he had built under Nicole's thumb. The meeting spot was set, an upscale restaurant, far from the eyes of anyone who could recognize them. Jackson arrived first, his heart racing, the weight of his decision still heavy on his chest. Jonathan was punctual, arriving exactly at the designated time. He walked in with the same calm confidence that had unsettled Jackson the day before. He offered a nod of acknowledgement before taking a seat. "You've made a decision," Jonathan said without preamble, his eyes piercing through Jackson's defenses. Jackson nodded, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "I'm in. I'll help you take her down." Jonathan's lips curled into a smile, but there was no warmth in it. It was a smile of victory. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms, studying Jackson closely. "Good," Jonathan said. "We can start right away. I'll need everything you have on Nicole, her financials, her plans, her contacts. You've seen how she operates. You know how to break her." Jackson felt a shiver run down his spine, but he forced himself to look Jonathan in the eye. There's no turning back now, he thought. "I'll get you what you need," Jackson replied. "But there's something you should know. Nicole's not going to let this go. She's dangerous." Jonathan's smile only widened. "I'm counting on it." Jackson had become an insider in Nicole Blackwell's world, gaining access to her most private dealings. He'd learned the rhythm of her operations, where she kept the files, who she trusted, and most importantly, what she trusted him with. Late at night, when Nicole was lost in her endless stream of calls and meetings, Jackson would slip into her office, pretending to sort through paperwork or organizing her digital files. But in reality, he was carefully copying financial documents, emails, and any communications that might give Jonathan Easton an edge. "Make sure those reports are filed by morning, Jackson," Nicole would say, her voice laced with the kind of authority that had once sent chills down his spine. But now, he only nodded, pretending to focus on the task at hand, all while slipping away pieces of her empire. In the following days, Jackson fed Jonathan information bit by bit, bank records, secret deals, and emails that tied Nicole to shady financial operations and underhanded political maneuvering. It was all the ammunition Jonathan needed to bring her empire to its knees. But as Jackson handed over piece after piece, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Was he truly making the right choice? Or was he simply exchanging one dangerous puppet master for another? Nicole had given him a purpose, had promised him a future, but she was using him, just like everyone else in her life. Jonathan had been right about that, and now he was the one who was going to tear down her empire, starting with exposing her darkest secrets. The story Jonathan had planned to leak was devastating. It would ruin Nicole's reputation, destroy her business dealings, and shatter her carefully crafted image. It would leave her vulnerable, untrustworthy in the eyes of the world. Jonathan had a network of powerful allies who would back him up once the story broke. But as Jackson prepared to send the final pieces of the puzzle to Jonathan, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Nicole. "Meeting tonight, don't be late." Jackson's stomach tightened. He had been expecting this, He had been waiting for this moment ever since he made his decision. It was time for the final confrontation. That evening, Jackson met Nicole in a sleek, high-rise penthouse overlooking the city. The lights from the skyline flickered below, casting long shadows across the room. Nicole was already there, sitting at a table, her fingers drumming lightly against the surface. She looked up as Jackson entered, a cold smile playing at the corners of her lips. "You look like you've made your decision," she said, her voice calm, as though she already knew everything. Jackson's heart pounded, but he refused to back down. "I've made my decision," he said, his voice steady. "I'm working with Jonathan. I'm helping him bring you down." For a long moment, Nicole said nothing. She simply stared at him, her eyes narrowing, analyzing him like a predator about to pounce. Finally, she spoke. "You think you've won, don't you?" she said softly. "You think you've outsmarted me. But you're wrong, Jackson. You've made a huge mistake." Jackson's breath caught in his throat. There was no fear in her voice, no hint of panic. Instead, she seemed amused. "Nicole, I'm not afraid of you anymore," Jackson said, his voice low but firm. She stood up slowly, her eyes never leaving his. "You should be," she said, a cold edge to her words. "You should be very afraid." Then, without warning, she pulled out her phone and hit send. Jackson's heart skipped a beat as his own phone buzzed, a new notification flashing on the screen. It was a news alert. Nicole Blackwell exposes Jonathan Easton's dark secrets. Exclusive details leaked. Jackson's mind went blank as he stared at the headline. It didn't make sense. He had just sent Jonathan everything he needed. He had betrayed her. Why was Nicole exposing Jonathan instead? Nicole watched him carefully, her lips curling into a satisfied grin. "You thought you could play me, Jackson? You thought you could outwit me? You were always just a tool to me, and now you're disposable. I made sure Jonathan Easton would never trust you. That's why you're no longer useful to me." Jackson's stomach dropped as the realization hit him. He had been played all along. Nicole's laugh was soft, but filled with cold triumph. "Jonathan will never believe you now. The information you gave him, it's all tainted. His reputation is already in ruins. And as for you, well, you've just made sure your own life will never be the same." Jackson took a step back, his mind racing. He had no way out now. Both Nicole and Jonathan had used him, played him like a pawn in their deadly game. He had lost. And as Nicole turned and walked away, leaving him alone in the cold, empty room, Jackson realized that in the world of the powerful, there was no room for loyalty. There was only manipulation, betrayal, and the crushing weight of being disposable. As the door clicked shut behind her, Jackson understood one final, bitter truth. There was no escaping the game. You're part of something bigger here. Thank you for being a beacon of hope. To explore another story that inspires, click the video to the left. And if you want to keep shining light with me, hit that subscribe button. See you soon.